They say the truth will set you free. But nobody warns you that sometimes the truth sounds like your wife's voice through a thin wall, calm and surgical, telling a lawyer she's about to strip you down to nothing. My name is Frank, and I was supposed to be broke, oblivious, and already beat. Instead, I pressed record. She thought she had me finished. She didn't know I was just getting started. I was the man who drove a 12-year-old sedan and bought his shirts at the thrift store. My wife Diane looked at that life and saw a mark. For months she'd been cold and distant, but I had no idea she was already on the phone with a divorce lawyer, a man named Hale, mapping out how to strip me down to zero before I ever saw a petition. She whispered that I was broke and finished, that they should clean me out before I noticed. So I did the one thing she never expected. I started recording. And what those recordings uncovered was a scheme that went far beyond our kitchen table. A quiet industry of fraud that had been operating in the dark for years. It started on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. I was in the hallway outside the kitchen, barefoot, holding a coffee mug that had a chip on the rim. Diane was on the phone, her voice low but not low enough. She'd been cold for months, shutting down conversations with one-word answers and spending more time locked in the bathroom with her phone than she did looking at me. That morning the door was open a crack, and I heard her say it. "He's broke, Mr. Hale, completely spent. We need to clean him out before he notices." I froze. I knew my worth. I'd built a small real estate portfolio over 20 years and owned our home free and clear. The idea that I was broke was a lie she needed a lawyer to believe so they could dismantle everything I'd built. She didn't know I'd heard, and she definitely didn't know that my phone was already in my hand. Quietly, I thumbed the voice recorder app and pressed the red circle. I had no plan, no strategy, just a gut feeling that whatever was happening behind my back was about to get a lot worse. Over the next 3 days, I kept recording. I left my phone on the counter during dinner, tucked into the bookshelf near the front door, anywhere Diane liked to pace when she thought I wasn't listening. The calls always happened when she thought I was out running errands or working in the garage. She never used her own phone when I was in the house. She'd wait until she was alone. But Hale's office line was in her recent call list, and I learned to watch the clock. Every other afternoon, at 3:15, she'd make herself a cup of tea and settle into the armchair by the window, and the calls would begin. By the end of the first week, I had 6 recordings totaling nearly 4 hours. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of a diner 3 towns over, plugged in my headphones, and started listening. The first call was bad enough, Diane describing my limited assets and how I was emotionally fragile, easy to manipulate in court. But the second call is the one that shifted everything. Diane sounded hesitant, almost nervous, and Hale's voice came through calm and practiced. "You're not the first person to feel this way," he said. "This is what we do. We protect our clients. We make sure the other side never sees the full picture. I've handled dozens of these, Mrs. Colson. You're in good hands." Something about the way he said dozens made my blood run cold. This wasn't a one-off divorce strategy. This was a system. Hale wasn't just advising Diane. He was coaching her on how to lie about my income, how to hide the joint savings account I hadn't checked in 2 months, how to shift the title of our cabin upstate into her sister's name temporarily. He even told her to make up a gambling problem and to get a therapist on record. "Create a narrative," Hale said. "Judges believe a man with a secret addiction will also lie about his finances. We don't need the truth. We just need the story." I stared at my phone screen and realized I wasn't just a husband being dumped. I was a target in a playbook that had been run so many times the lines were smooth. Hale had turned my marriage into a fraud factory, and Diane was the latest product on the assembly line. I kept recording for another 10 days. I cataloged every mention of hidden assets, every instruction to mislead the court, every cold-blooded detail. And then I found the piece that broke the pattern wide open. On a Thursday afternoon, while Diane was in the shower, I dug through her desk drawer and found a folder labeled Hale and Associates, Estate Planning. Inside were intake forms for other clients, couples I'd never heard of, all with notes in Hale's handwriting. One note read, "Wife unaware, hiding 401k rollover." Another, "Claim husband is a flight risk. Liquidate joint property fast." Hale wasn't just Diane's divorce lawyer. He was running a pipeline that turned spouses into silent partners, coaching them to strip the other person down before they ever saw a courtroom. And he'd been doing it for years, apparently, without anyone catching on, because the victims never knew what hit them until it was too late and they couldn't afford to fight back. That was when I understood the real danger. If I confronted Diane now, she'd tip off Hale, and he'd vanish the evidence. If I hired a lawyer and filed first, I'd still be playing in a legal system that often believes the first story it hears, especially when it's backed by a smooth-talking attorney with a folder full of fake narratives. But if I did nothing, they'd finish cleaning me out. I had to move, but I had to move in a direction they'd never see coming. I made a decision that night, sitting in the dark at the kitchen table after Diane had gone upstairs. The recordings were damning, but only if someone with the power to act listened to them. I started researching. The State Bar Association has a disciplinary board that investigates attorney misconduct. The district attorney's office has a fraud unit. My recordings were evidence, not just of my wife's betrayal, but of a criminal enterprise. I could hand them over, not to a divorce judge, but to the people who could stop the machine completely. But I needed more. I needed to know exactly how many victims there were, how long this had been going on, and whether there were other lawyers involved. So I kept my mouth shut, let Diane believe her secret was safe, and began building the case that would end the career of every attorney who thought clean him out was just another day at the office. I had no idea yet that the biggest threat wasn't Hale. It was the person sleeping 15 feet away from me, and she was about to find out what happens when a quiet man stops being quiet. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. Diane hadn't gone to sleep. She was moving back and forth, probably on another call. I slipped my phone into my pocket. The recordings safely backed up to a cloud account she didn't know existed, and I left the house through the back door. I drove to the all-night diner on Route 12, the one with the flickering neon and the waitress who never asks questions. And I spread the photocopied pages from Hale's folder across the table while my coffee cooled. The intake forms were a roadmap. Each one had a client name, a spouse's name, and a list of assets. But what caught my eye was a small notation in the corner of every page, a code always starting with the letter H followed by a number. H17, H23, H41. It took me an hour to realize the numbers weren't random, they corresponded to months and years. H17 meant the case originated in January of 2017. H23 was November of 2023. Hale's system was methodical, and the criminal part was that in every single case, the notation included a dollar amount and a single word: liquidate, conceal, rebuild, or exit. He was tracking outcomes, like a salesman tracking commissions. I started making calls. Not from my own phone, I bought a prepaid burner at a gas station off the interstate. The first 3 numbers I dialed belonged to people who'd moved or changed carriers. The 4th was answered on the 3rd ring by a man whose voice sounded hollowed out. I told him my name was David, that I was looking into a lawyer named Hale, and that I thought he might have been one of his cases. The line went dead silent for 6 seconds. Then the man said, I can't talk about that. I'm under a settlement agreement. But he didn't hang up. I asked if the settlement was fair. He laughed, one sharp cough of a laugh, and said, "It was fair if you consider losing your house and your kids fair." She got everything. I didn't even know what hit me until the judge banged the gavel. And Hale? He called it a clean resolution. He gave me permission to call him Tom. Over the next week, Tom and I spoke 4 times. He described the same playbook I'd heard on Diane's calls: the fabricated addictions, the hidden accounts, the sudden therapist appointments. His wife had been coached to claim he was emotionally abusive and financially erratic. By the time the divorce was final, she'd moved their joint savings to an account in her mother's name. And Hale had taken his fee, nearly $40,000, directly from the assets she'd hidden. Tom had no money left for an appeal. "I just wanted it to be over," he told me. And that's what he counts on. Tom's story broke something open in me. This wasn't a scheme confined to my living room. Hale had refined his method down to a script, and he'd been using it for at least 7 years, probably longer. I called the State Bar Association's ethics hotline from a payphone outside a library and asked how to file a complaint against an attorney. The woman on the line was professional, but weary. She'd heard it all before. "You'll need documentation," she said. "Dates, times, specifics, not just allegations." I told her I had recordings, not just of my own case, but of Hale instructing a client to commit fraud. She paused. "You understand that recording someone without their consent can be a crime in this state?" she said. "Depends on the circumstances. If you're a party to the conversation, it's one-party consent. But if you're recording a conversation you're not part of," I hung up. I'd recorded calls where I was not a party. Diane's calls that I overheard and captured from a distance. I'd opened my phone's recorder while she spoke to Hale in another room. That wasn't legal. And if I handed that over, I might be the one facing charges. I sat in my truck for half an hour, my heart a hard knot in my chest, and I understood that I was now walking a tightrope between exposing a criminal and incriminating myself. That's when Diane's behavior changed again. She stopped making calls from the living room. Her phone was always with her, and she'd taken to whispering even when I wasn't home, as if she knew the walls had ears. One evening I came back from work earlier than expected, and she was sitting at the dining table with a stack of papers. She slid them into a folder the moment she heard the door. I asked what those were. "Casual, just tax stuff," she said, her smile thin and plastic. Later that night, I checked the drawer where she kept the Hale folder. It was empty. She'd moved everything. I realized she was closing the trap. The narrative needed to be locked in before I filed anything. Hale would have coached her. If my name hit a court petition, his entire scheme could be exposed by the discovery process. So they needed me to remain passive, unaware, while they finished rearranging the chessboard. I had to act now. I drove 2 hours to the county prosecutor's office the next morning, carrying a folder of my legally obtained property records and a written summary of what I'd overheard. No illegal recordings, just my notes. I asked to speak with someone in the fraud unit. A man named Investigator Miles agreed to see me. He was late 50s, with a tired face that had seen every flavor of human dishonesty. I laid out the pattern: Hale's intake forms, the coded notations, Tom's story, the playbook. I didn't mention the recordings directly. I said I had personal knowledge of his methods. Miles listened, didn't take a single note, and then leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Colson, I've heard about Hale for 5 years. We've tried twice to build a case, but every time the victims settle. They sign non-disclosure agreements. They're so broken by the process that they just want to disappear. Without a cooperating victim, we can't get a warrant. What if I'm the cooperating victim? I said. But you haven't filed for divorce. And you're not officially a client of Hale's, Miles said. You're just a guy who overheard some stuff. That's not enough. I felt the floor drop. I asked how much was enough. He told me I'd need to be in a position where Hale's conduct could be introduced as direct evidence in a legal proceeding. And the only way that happened was if I was an active litigant, meaning I'd need to be in a divorce court, with Hale as opposing counsel. And then my recordings, if legally obtained, could be evidence. But that would still leave me vulnerable to the wiretapping issue. I left his office with a single, terrifying piece of clarity. The only way to stop Hale was to let him think he was winning. To walk into the divorce exactly as they planned, and to catch him red-handed inside a courtroom where the rules of evidence would finally work for me. But that meant I had to endure the entire assault, the false narratives, the hidden assets, the public humiliation, all while secretly building the case that would undo them. When I got home, the house was too quiet. I found Diane upstairs, packing a suitcase. I'm staying at my sister's for a few days, she said, not looking at me. I just need some space to think. Her voice was steady, rehearsed. I knew the script. The separation was Phase 3. Phase 4 would be the emergency custody petition for the accounts, the moment she'd claim I was dangerous or volatile. I had maybe 72 hours before the papers landed. That night, alone in the house, I made 3 decisions. First, I copied every financial document I could find and stored them in a fireproof safe at a friend's house 20 miles away. Second, I wrote a detailed statement, signed and notarized, describing everything I'd observed and heard with timestamps, and I sent it to myself via certified mail, unopened. Third, I called Tom once more. What if I told you there was a way to make sure Hale never does this to another person? But you'd have to testify. There was a long pause. Then Tom said, I'd say I'm tired of being quiet. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my legal pad when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Only one line, she knows you've been recording. She's going to delete everything. Move now. I stared at the screen. Somewhere, a line had been crossed. And the only way forward was straight through the fire. I didn't hesitate. The text message had no name, just a local area code, but I knew in my gut it wasn't a hoax. Someone inside Hale's orbit had just thrown me a lifeline, and if I didn't grab it immediately, everything I'd documented would vanish. I grabbed my keys, drove 4 miles to the 24-hour copy shop, and printed every single document a second time. Originals into the safe deposit box I'd quietly opened at a bank across town 2 days earlier. Copies into a sealed envelope addressed to myself, which I dropped in a public mailbox on the way back. I needed a chain of custody, something that would stand up if this went where I thought it was going. When I pulled into my driveway at 2 in the morning, the house was dark, but the front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and felt the emptiness before I saw it. The filing cabinet in my study was pulled open, drawers hanging. Diane hadn't just packed a suitcase, she'd come back while I was out and swept the place. The folder I'd kept with my property deeds and bank statements was gone. So was the legal pad where I'd written down dates and times of her phone calls. She'd taken the router too, which meant she thought there might be security footage. There wasn't. I'd never installed cameras. But the fact that she'd taken the router told me she was cleaning house with professional guidance. I called investigator Miles at 8 the next morning. He listened while I described the break-in, the missing documents, the warning text. She's accelerating, he said. Hale's probably filing something today. If you want to get ahead of this, you need to be in a courthouse with a lawyer of your own before noon. He gave me the name of an attorney who'd gone up against Hale before, a woman named Julia Carver, who specialized in divorce fraud cases. I called her office from the parking lot of a grocery store, my voice still steady but my hands shaking. She agreed to meet me that afternoon. Before I could get to her office, the papers landed. A process server found me at a gas station, handed me a thick envelope, and said, "You've been served, sir." Inside was a petition for divorce, an application for an emergency protection order, and a sworn affidavit from Diane claiming I was emotionally unstable, financially manipulative, and verbally abusive. She alleged that I'd secretively recorded her without consent, that I'd threatened to destroy her in a divorce, and that she feared for her physical safety. The affidavit had 7 pages. Every paragraph was a sentence I'd never spoken, a scene that had never happened. The narrative was so complete, so detailed, that I almost admired the craftsmanship. Until I saw the footnote, prepared with the assistance of Mr. Hale, Esquire, that was the moment the game changed forever. Hale hadn't just coached Diane, he'd ghostwritten perjured testimony, and the emergency protection order came with an immediate freeze on all joint accounts and a temporary eviction order requiring me to vacate the marital home within 24 hours. I was now officially a suspect in my own life, locked out of my own money, labeled an abuser by the woman who'd spent weeks conspiring to steal everything. I drove to Julia Carver's office with the papers on the passenger seat, my mind blank. She was a sharp, direct woman in her 40s, the kind of person who reads quickly and speaks slower than she thinks. She went through every page while I sat in a leather chair that made an embarrassing squeak every time I shifted. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me. "You have recordings," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. She asked if I'd recorded conversations I wasn't part of. I told her yes, some of them. She explained that under our state's wiretapping statute, one-party consent applies only if you're a participant. My recordings of Diane's private phone calls from another room could be a felony, but there was an exception for evidence of a crime in progress, and if Hale was coaching perjury, the recordings could be admitted under the crime-fraud exception. It was a gamble. A judge could exclude them, and I'd be exposed to criminal charges. Or a judge could admit them, and Hale would be looking at disbarment and a possible prison sentence. She then asked the question that made my stomach drop. "Frank, who else has heard these recordings?" I told her nobody, except that I'd played them for Tom, another victim, over the phone. She went pale. "You played intercepted communications for a third party. That's a separate felony." I'd inadvertently made Tom a witness to my own crime. The only way to protect us both was to get the recordings into a legitimate legal proceeding before anyone investigated my own actions. I agreed to file a counter-motion for an evidentiary hearing, arguing that Diane's petition was fraudulent and that her attorney had manufactured false evidence. Julia warned me, if we failed, I'd be permanently labeled as an abuser, penniless, and likely facing charges. If we succeeded, Hale would fall, Diane would be exposed, and I might still lose the house and have a criminal record for wiretapping. There was no clean exit. I told her to file it anyway. That night, sleeping on an air mattress in Tom's basement, because I'd surrendered my keys to comply with the order, I started receiving more text messages from different numbers, all from people who claimed to be former clients or employees of Hale's. One was a paralegal named Mina, who'd worked for Hale for 3 years. She said she'd quit because she couldn't stomach watching another unsuspecting spouse get ambushed. She confirmed that Hale coached clients to fabricate abuse allegations as a standard tactic. She'd kept copies of internal memos and client intake forms. I asked her if she'd be willing to sign an affidavit. She said she would, if it meant he'd never practice again. That changed everything. Now I didn't just have recordings of Diane, I had an insider ready to testify to Hale's pattern across dozens of cases. Julia said we should bring Mina straight to the Bar Association and the district attorney simultaneously. We did. On a rainy Tuesday, we met with the chief disciplinary counsel at the state bar and submitted a 40-page complaint backed by my recordings, Tom's sworn account, Mina's documents, and the spreadsheet of coded cases from Hale's own folder. The bar counsel, a woman named Dr. Alvarez, read through the evidence for 20 minutes in silence, then looked up and said, "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've never seen a case filed against an attorney before the opposing party even files for divorce. But if half of this is verifiable, Mr. Hale is going to lose his license before the end of the month." Then the district attorney's investigator, Miles, called with news that raised the stakes even higher. His office had cross-checked Hale's financial records with the coded cases, and they'd found a pattern of cash withdrawals matching the timing of each divorce settlement. Hale wasn't just charging fees, he was receiving kickbacks from financial advisors and real estate agents who profited from the forced sale of marital assets. It was an organized ring, and two of the couples had reported to law enforcement that Hale had recommended a particular therapist who then provided expert testimony in court supporting the abuse narrative, testimony that was later found to be fabricated. Hale had corrupted multiple parts of the system. The restraining order hearing was set for the following Monday. Julia told me that was the battlefield. If we win the hearing, we win the war. If we lose, you're drowning. Are you ready? I looked at the stack of evidence, at the notarized statements from Tom and Mina, at the certified mail I'd sent myself. And I thought about the man I was 6 months ago, the one who drove a beat-up sedan and didn't want any trouble. That man was gone. The man standing in Julia's office was someone who understood that the quietest people sometimes carry the loudest truths. The morning of the hearing, I put on a suit I'd bought from a clearance rack and walked to the courthouse alone because I couldn't afford an Uber after my accounts were frozen. The hallway was long and marble and smelled like floor wax and anxiety. As I rounded the corner to the courtroom door, I saw Diane standing with Hale. She looked composed, almost serene, wrapped in the confidence of a story she'd rehearsed for months. They hadn't noticed me. Hale was murmuring something in her ear, his hand on her elbow, like a coach sending a player onto the field. Then they turned, and our eyes met. Hers flickered. His didn't. The bailiff opened the door. All rise for the Honorable Judge Whitmore. I walked in, sat at my table with Julia, and watched as Hale and Diane settled across the aisle. I could feel the weight of every recording file in the cloud, the words of people I'd never met, but whose lives had been shattered. The judge asked for opening statements. Julia rose and said 7 words that shifted the atmosphere in the room. "Your Honor, this petition is a fraud." Hale's jaw tightened. The judge paused, then said, "Explain." And I knew that whatever happened in the next 60 minutes, the machine was finally about to stop. Julia did not wait for the judge to ask twice. She lifted the first exhibit from the table, a transcript of the call where Hale told Diane to create a therapist narrative, and she read it aloud in a voice that carried to the back row. Create a narrative. Judges believe a man with a secret addiction will also lie about his finances. She let the words hang. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. She then called Investigator Miles from the district attorney's office. He testified that his unit had examined Hale's financial records and found a web of kickbacks involving a therapist, two real estate agents, and a title company that all profited when marital homes were sold quickly during divorce proceedings. The scheme stretched back 9 years and involved at least 33 cases. Each one followed the same blueprint: false allegations, hidden assets, forced liquidation, with Hale collecting referral fees that never appeared on any legal invoice. Miles placed a spreadsheet in front of the judge. It was the same coded list I'd first seen in Diane's folder, now annotated with dollar amounts in the right margin. Then came Mina. She walked to the stand with her head high, a young woman who had spent 3 years watching the machine operate from the inside because she was too afraid to leave. She described how Hale would dictate the abuse narrative to a new client within the first consultation. How he had a checklist. Number 1, isolate the spouse from joint finances. Number 2, establish a safety concern. Number 3, file an emergency order. She testified that he called this the clean break protocol. She said he laughed once about how predictable judges were when they heard the word afraid. Hale's cross-examination was brief and desperate. He asked Mina if she had any recording of him saying that. She said no. He asked if she was a disgruntled former employee. She said yes. She was disgruntled, because she'd watched innocent people lose their children and their savings. The judge overruled his objection. When it was Diane's turn, Julia called her to the stand not as the petitioner, but as a hostile witness. Diane walked up with her chin tilted, still wearing the expression of someone who believed the story she'd been given to wear. Julia asked her one question. "Mrs. Colson, does your husband have a gambling addiction?" Diane answered too quickly. "I don't know what he does with his time. I found receipts." Julia placed a single page on the stand. It was a bank statement showing my account activity for the past 3 years. No casino withdrawals, no lottery tickets, no wire transfers to betting sites, just gas stations, grocery stores, and a monthly donation to a food pantry. "These are the receipts," Julia said. "Where are yours?" Diane's face changed. The performance cracked at the edges. She looked at Hale, and what she saw on his face must have been terror rather than confidence, because she began to cry. Not the tears of a woman who had been caught, but the tears of someone who finally understood that she had been a tool, that the man who promised her everything had written her lines and collected his cut while she did the dirty work. She looked at me then, across the aisle, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. My wife, the real one, the person before the coldness set in. She was terrified and tiny and desperately sad. And I felt, against every instinct, a quiet grief for her. Judge Whitmore called a recess. When she returned, her voice was low and unhurried. She addressed Hale directly. "Mr. Hale, I am referring this transcript to the State Bar Disciplinary Board and the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. Your conduct in this matter, and in the matters described by Investigator Miles and this witness, constitutes what I can only describe as a systematic subversion of the family court process." She granted Julia's motion to dismiss the protection order with prejudice. She vacated the freeze on my accounts. And then she did something I had not expected. She ordered Diane to pay my attorney's fees and sanctioned Hale personally for abuse of process in the amount of $47,000, payable within 30 days. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright and indifferent. Hale walked past me without speaking, his briefcase clutched like a shield. A camera crew from the local news was waiting on the courthouse steps. Someone had tipped them off. Mina stood beside me, and when a reporter asked her why she waited 3 years to speak, she said, "Because nobody ever asked." 2 weeks later, the State Bar Disciplinary Board suspended Hale's license pending a full hearing. He voluntarily surrendered it 3 days after that, rather than face the testimony of the 33 victims who had finally come forward once Mina's affidavit went public. The district attorney filed charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, subornation of perjury, and commercial bribery. The therapist who had written fake evaluations surrendered her license. The real estate agents and title officer accepted plea deals in exchange for cooperation. The ring that had operated in plain sight for nearly a decade was dismantled because one man with a chipped coffee mug had pressed record. And Diane? She moved to her sister's permanently. I heard from a mutual friend that she was in therapy, that she'd been diagnosed with severe anxiety and had been manipulated by Hale not just legally but emotionally, that he'd convinced her she'd get nothing unless she followed his script. I did not call her. I didn't need to. I had stopped being her adversary the moment I realized that the person who whispered to her lawyer was also a person who had been whispered to. But here is the detail that still sits with me, the one I didn't see coming. About a month after the hearing, I received a handwritten letter in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, maybe 60 years old, with a tired smile and kind eyes. On the back, in careful cursive, Eleanor Hale, 1987, I warned them. Thank you for finishing what I started. I did some research and learned that Eleanor was Hale's first wife, who had filed for divorce 30 years earlier alleging fraud and coercion. He'd destroyed her in court, taken the house, taken the kids, and left her with a record of mental instability that she'd never been able to clear. She'd been writing letters to the Bar Association for decades. Nobody had ever listened because she was just the crazy ex-wife. Now she was in a nursing home in southern Ohio, and someone had sent her the news article about my case. She asked if I'd visit. I drove down on a Saturday, took my old truck with the crack in the mirror, and sat with her in a sunroom that smelled like coffee and thyme. She held my hand and said, "You did what I couldn't." I told her that her letter gave me the last piece I needed to understand I hadn't just stopped a lawyer. I'd finished a fight that began before I even met Diane, a fight being waged by the quiet ones who'd been silenced for so long that the world forgot they'd ever spoken. I still live modestly. My house is too big for one person, but the tomatoes are doing well. I keep Eleanor's photograph on my desk, next to the notarized statement I sent myself. Some people ask if I'm lonely. I'm not, because every once in a while I get a call from someone like Tom, someone who heard my story and found the courage to share theirs. And I tell them the same thing I learned. The truth doesn't need a loud voice. It just needs a record that can't be erased. If someone tries to clean you out, don't scream. Don't break things. Just press record and let the truth do what it does best. It waits. And then it wins. People ask me if I regret not confronting Diane the moment I heard her voice on that phone. I don't. The man who would have slammed a door and demanded answers was the man she expected. The one in the story they'd already written for me. But the man who sat in a dark kitchen and chose silence over noise? That was the man who walked out of the courthouse whole. Quietness isn't weakness. It's just the space where you decide whether you're going to break or build. Eleanor Hale taught me something I didn't expect to learn at 71. She spent 30 years writing letters that nobody read because she didn't have the right language. She didn't have a recording. She didn't have a coded spreadsheet or a whistleblower or an investigator who'd sit in a diner and listen. She just had her own voice, and the system told her over and over that her voice alone wasn't proof. The day I sat with her in that sunroom, she said, "They don't teach you how to fight when you're already on the ground." She was right. And the thing that still keeps me up at night is wondering how many Eleanors are still out there, living in nursing homes, or crashing with relatives, or sleeping in their cars, because someone with a law degree decided they were worth more broken than whole. The scheme I uncovered wasn't unique to Hale. Every state in this country has a version of him. A lawyer who treats the legal system like a vending machine for the rich and unscrupulous. They count on exhaustion. They count on shame. They count on the fact that most people who get chewed up by the machine would rather walk away in silence than fight back and risk being called vindictive or paranoid. So the fraud goes on, one quiet settlement at a time, while the rest of us assume the courts are working the way they're supposed to. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you because if there's one thing the last 18 months proved, it's that the machinery of fraud stops the moment someone documents it. Not fights it with anger, just documents it. Dates, times, transcripts, witnesses. The truth doesn't need a lawyer to be true. It just needs a file that can't be corrupted and a person who refuses to delete it. So here's what I'd say to anyone listening who's in the middle of their own quiet nightmare. You might feel powerless. You might feel like the walls are listening and everyone's already chosen the other side. But you're not invisible. Somewhere there's a Mina, a Tom, an investigator Miles. Somewhere there's a version of you that already knows what to do. Keep your records. Tell someone you trust. And if you have the chance to press record, press record. The truth is patient, but it shouldn't have to wait 30 years. If this story meant something to you today, do one small thing. Hit that like button. Subscribe to keep these stories coming. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because you never know who's sitting in a dark kitchen right now, wondering if anyone will believe them. And as always, thank you for giving a quiet man a long moment to speak.